all of this is also happening on the heels of some pretty major machinations inside of Congress that directly concern Ukraine aid and whether we're going to have a government shutdown. Let's go and put this up there on the screen. This was reported by Playbook yesterday, kind of the internal DC newsletter for the Inside Congress. And here's what they said, quote, one senior GOP lawmaker told Playbook, that is crazy. We do not have the votes in the Republican conference to do any Ukraine funding. One thing that they note is that McCarthy will host a meeting with President Zelensky, but it will not be a one-on-one meeting, and it will be with multiple other leaders from the House of Representatives, including chairmen and ranking members, with no one-on-one. Also noteworthy, on the Senate side, all 100 senators are attending a meeting with President Zelensky, but on the House side, that is not happening. There also is a pretty major push coming from MAGA influencers and other conservative influencers to lead a charge against funding for Ukraine in Congress. One reason I think that's significant is we did a whole story here yesterday about how Ken Paxton was effectively saved by a MAGA influence campaign. So you can't underestimate how powerful some of these people are. One of them is Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA, just giving people a taste of some of the stuff that's out there. He writes, Zelensky's coming to D.C. next week to bully the American public into writing another $24 billion check to a quagmire. He's coming here days after his transgender English spokesperson threatened to hunt down and kill anti-Ukraine critics and propagandists. He's doing this after threatening his European allies that millions of refugees across the EU will start terrorizing their nations if he doesn't receive perpetual financing of the war. The American public must stop being extorted by a foreign gangster, not one more dime. So whether you agree or disagree, that is a flavor of what is coming from one of the activist parts of the GOP. You see it definitely represented in the voices of people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and several others, but you also see it Representative Dan Bishop and others from the Freedom Caucus who are refusing to include in any continuing resolution to fund the government any of this Ukraine aid and the disaster aid also that President Biden tried to put together, setting us up for a major showdown with the Senate and the president, who both say that it's not negotiable. Any increased funding of the government has to come with Ukraine aid, especially to have this fight. It's an insult to Zelensky to do it while he is here in Washington. That's why we have to pass it right now. And I just don't think that's very likely right now, Krystal, with all the fights that are happening.
The reason that the Ukraine aid and the so-called continuing resolution, which is just basically like a budget patch so that the government doesn't shut down, the idea had been to attach those things together. This was sort of McCarthy's idea too, and pass them both through simultaneously to try to keep everyone together on these things. And we're days away at this point from a possible shutdown. It's an October 1 deadline. There had been a tentative deal just among the House Republican caucus. We're not even talking about the Senate. We're not even talking about what the president wants. But just to get it through the House with Republican votes, there had been a tentative deal between the House Freedom Caucus, some members of the House Freedom Caucus, and some of the more moderate members of that caucus. But that deal instantly, when it was announced, was completely obliterated and shot down, primarily by other members of the House Freedom Caucus who did not agree with the person who had been negotiating it. So even the original idea was, okay, well, that might be able to get through the House, but it's probably not going to get through the Senate, which is still controlled by Democrats. Even the idea that was going to get through the House has now fallen apart. And so that's how these things are tied together, because the idea had been to put the aid along with the continuing resolution and pass them as one. Well, now there is really no sort of clear end game in sight in terms of getting this government funding through. So another government shutdown game of chicken here looms. Kevin McCarthy, his speakership potentially in danger, Matt Gaetz in particular making a lot of noise. I would say that those are kind of empty threats because they still don't have a real alternative to McCarthy. But you'll remember, as part of his speakership deal, it made it very easy for this vote to be brought up to remove him from the speakership. So he's running scared. There's a lot going on there. It's very ugly. I mean, he was like cursing at the caucus and yelling at them, and Gaetz is coming back at him. So it's a total mess over there. And this Ukraine aid funding is caught up in the whole situation.
You know, and McCarthy won't even commit to passing any Ukraine aid. So he was asked about this late last night. They said, will you expect this aid to eventually pass? He says, quote, I think we will look through it. But the one thing I think the House is very concerned about is what's happening right now in America. He was also asked why the entire House Republican Conference is not meeting with Zelensky, unlike the Senate. He said, well, they can run things their way. We run it our way. If he wants wants to meet with other people, he can meet with them if he wants to.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all signs point to no confidence within the GOP conference that any of this Ukraine aid will be able to pass. It also raises a question: will the Senate and the president shut the government down over Ukraine aid and disaster relief? Because there's two ways it could go. If the GOP, puts through a continuing resolution which includes Ukraine aid, but then is about federal spending, I think that the Democrats and the president would win, because it would be like, oh, they're trying to cut food stamps or something like that. But if the government is shut down over not funding Ukraine, and then the cynical ploy of pairing it with funding for like Maui and for Hawaii and disaster relief, I think that's a whole other conversation as to whether you're literally going to shut down the United States government over not funding Ukraine.
But those aren't the contours right now, because even the proposed deal from that has now fallen apart with the Republican caucus called for like 8% cuts to everything except, of course, defense spending, because we can't touch that, Lord, God forbid. So it was going after things like food stamps and other programs that are really critical to people given how tough the economy is for a lot of ordinary Americans. So anyway, there's a lot of pieces here. I have no predictions about how this is all going to work out, but it's hard to see how they're going to navigate through these next few days without some sort of a shutdown situation, given, again, that even the House Republican caucus cannot agree on what they want to do with this situation. Last thing I'll say on the Ukraine aid is if you just asked members of the House, Democrats and Republicans, do they support the aid, you'd have an overwhelming majority.
Absolutely.
The issue comes in because it's still a minority. You have a majority of regular Republicans in the country who are against additional aid, but it's still a minority, even in the House Republican caucus, that want to block all aid going forward. The problem is when you tie these things together and you get it into these sort of negotiations, Democrats are not going to help House Republicans pass like this deal that they're trying to come to together within themselves. So that's where this all gets really complicated and very dicey.
Yeah, very well said.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.